All right. Hey, everyone. This is Eytan from CommonTime Pathways. I'm joined here by a very special guest. Say hi.
Hi, my name is Ryan Zellner. I'm the CEO of the International Society for Music Education, and we're here with our stories, our members. So thank you, Aton, for joining us today.
This is awesome. I'm so glad that we get to do this joint podcast. So,
Absolutely.
Common Time Pathways learned about the International Society for Music Education, and I became a member, and the company, therefore, is a member, and we're really excited because Ryan reached out because he loves what we're doing, and so we get to be a guest on Ryan's podcast for the International Society for Music Ed, which is really exciting, and we're just kind of doing this thing together. It's really wonderful to meet you. I can tell you I was a music teacher in the U.S. in the Northeast for 12 years before I decided to leave education and pursue Common Time Pathways as a full-time venture of mine. It's been one heck of a journey trying to connect with people around the world about the pathway between being a child and making music and being an adult and making music. And when I learned about the International Society for Music Ed, it was a really wonderful opportunity for me to just kind of explore what happens in other countries, other continents, and have a little bit more knowledge for myself. But then, Ryan, when you introduced yourself to me, it was really exciting to hear kind of your thoughts and your perspectives on trends that are going on, especially with regards to music education as a whole. So, yeah, just tell me a bit about your story. It would be great if you could just introduce yourself as well, and we'll just kind of get going on some of these great questions we've got for everyone today.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, of course. I think what's interesting about everyone that I talk to, we all have a journey into the music education field, whether it's performance or education or academia or whatever it is, we all started somewhere. And most of the time we started teaching in public school. And so my journey started teaching high school band in a town in Pennsylvania. I did that for 14 years and had pretty good success, but I realized I wanted to do more with my life. I wanted to have a bigger impact. So I started as a national program director for Little Kids Rock, which is
That's right.
yeah. So where we put modern band programs or popular music programs in school districts around the country. And then from there, I took some different ventures, and it eventually landed me here at ISME as the CEO and working with academics from all around the world. We have over 2,000 members from 90 different countries. We host an international world conference every 2 years. In between, we support regional conferences. We have a journal that comes out, and it's just great because this music ecosystem just connects us all. And as soon as I saw Eitan's membership come in, because I actually do look at everybody as they join, and like I email them and talk to them. I was like, this sounds amazing. I want to have a conversation with this man. And so that brings us to this call today.
That's really exciting. I mean, I'm really excited to be a member, mostly because I think that, as you mentioned, music connects us all. And the education profession is really one of those that is needed everywhere all the time. It's maybe the second or third oldest profession in the world is teaching children things. And I think that we really need to start thinking about music education a little bit more internationally, because now borders are starting to melt as the world becomes more globalized through the internet, through online education, and through everything else that's been going on, especially since COVID. And so I'm really, really excited about this. And of course, I would love to ask you kind of, do you want to ask me a question first? I feel like I don't want to monopolize at the beginning here.
Well, let's start with how I normally start, which is just how did you, if you think back to little Aton, how did you get started in music? What was your like first experience? How did you decide like this is what I want to do?
So
We go way back sometimes.
I was very lucky. My older brothers played the piano while I was in my mother's womb. And so I came out having heard 2 or 3 hours a day of practicing. There were two older brothers. And by the time I was three, I'm not sure if this is true, but I like to joke that I was correcting their fingering. It's just one of those things where when I first went to play the piano, was already in love with it at age 5, and then I picked up the trumpet when I was 9 or 10 in school. And forgive the recovering trumpet player persona issues that I got going on here, but no, it was a ton of fun, and I've had a great time being a trumpet player. Got a bachelor's degree actually at Boston University with Terry Everson as a music performance major. But I also really desperately wanted to be a music teacher. I knew that from age 15. When I joined choir, actually, I had a free period in my high school schedule, and it happened to align with concert choir. And it was fantastic that I walk in and all of my friends who are in choir turn around and go, "What are you doing here?" And I say, I have a free period. I thought I'd join. And they say, "Can you sing?" I said, "We're about to find out." And turns out I'm not that bad. I still actually perform, which is great. I sing tenor with the Tanglewood Festival Chorus and the Boston Symphony and the Boston Pops, which is great. But then I also spent most of my career, as I mentioned, being a music teacher. And I did that in the Boston and Cambridge public schools, as well as fine arts director in a town outside of Boston for a while, mostly during COVID, hilariously. And then found myself in a position where I was frustrated with the fact that all of our athletes were getting scholarships left, right, and middle to go to college, and I couldn't so much as really deeply connect a French horn or viola student with the proper person to see if there was any scholarship out there, and decided to try and see what CommonTime Pathways might do for people. And that's my whole musical journey. I fell in love with music. I don't remember a time I wasn't in love with music, but I do know that I wanted to be a high school music director from 15 years old. I knew what I wanted to do. So music ed was one of those things that I needed to apply for. Of course, I also had the father who said music performance is not a real major because we're immigrants and we didn't come here so that you could go get a music degree. And so I had to convince him that music performance and education was a great way to both be a musician and have a viable career option right out of college. And I think that that's true for a lot of music kids. Not everyone's made out for, going to Juilliard or the Royal Conservatory, or the Royal College of Music, and there's not a shortage of students who should be teaching music. As you mentioned, I think you said to me, there's something about there is a shortage of music teachers in the world. So can I shift it back really quick and ask you how you figured that out and what that looks like in other places? Because it seems that while there's a bit of a shortage of music teachers in the U.S., there's more a shortage of music teachers who want to get paid practically minimum wage to be music teachers in the U.S. So it's a bit of an economic thing, but the actual number of people who want to be music teachers isn't necessarily, scarce, which is kind of interesting. Talk to me about what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think those are interesting questions, and I love the idea of opportunities. I always feel like the people who become successful in their careers take these opportunities. You took that opportunity to jump into that choir class and start singing and take that and see how that goes in your life. And that's when we look across the world and different projects that we're in, we tend to look at it through a lens like the U.S. has. For example, you have experience with music of some sort in your middle school, high school years, then you apply to a college, maybe you can get a scholarship, maybe you can't. Who knows why you chose that college? Maybe it's proximity or they were the ones who accepted you. And then you go through your 4 years, you get certified, and then you land in this public school or private school teaching sphere of some sort, right? And that's not the system that we see in every country. It goes, it runs the gamut as far as, like, I was working in Belize in August, and the idea of like a music education certification, it just doesn't exist. So there's not even music. There's people that have music experience, but they're not certified to teach music, or they haven't gone through an education program on how to apply those skills. And we all know that performing music and being able to teach music are two different things. Sometimes they work well together, and sometimes they just don't. But what we're seeing, I think, globally is generally this shortage of music teachers for a variety of reasons. One is that maybe the school music programs haven't moved with the times, so people have found less and less importance on it. So in the US, we're very much still anchored in this concert band, choir, orchestra sort of model. But we see this infusion of popular music, right, and starting to bring it back. But people have lost that connection. So when you lose that connection, it's harder to advocate for its infusion, because how many people are in concert band or listening to concert band music? And I love the whole band sphere. I grew up in that. But we know that audience is dwindling, and sometimes the programs haven't changed. Other times it's more of an economic decision. If you come out in the US and you graduate, you might be able to get a job, depending on the state, for 40, 45, maybe 50,000, maybe more in some urban areas. But compared to if you got that same degree in engineering, you'd be making almost twice as much, right? So the idea of being a livable rate and being able to compete, and of course there's other like sort of economic factors that play into that and political factors. But I think we still see people getting into it as far as students and getting into it being music because they have a passion for it, right? You get into it because you have a love for it, and then you want to pass that love on to someone else, right? So that's the idea. The challenge is that even if we can get enough teachers into the or enough students, pre-service teachers into the system, many of them when they get out into the public school or private school system, they end up quitting after 3 or 4 years. There's the burnout rate's real because what they were learning in their undergrad doesn't always connect with what they're going to see in the music classroom. But if you're dealing, for example, if you're in China, the music curriculum is the same across the country, and it's just handed to you. So you have this. You don't have necessarily the flexibility that you do in the U.S., but you know what's there, and you know what you're doing. Versus in the United States, especially when it comes to things like general music, you can pick and choose what you want to do. And so then it becomes, how do you quantify something where it looks different everywhere, right? So it becomes even harder to justify what's going on. So you have everything from around the world of no systems to how do you integrate systems into it, and how do you get people that, like, for example, for Belize, there's no school music that's during the day. They don't take a general music class. So now you have people that have reached their adulthood without doing any sort of, I would say structured, maybe not the right word, but structured music activities, meaning that they've never worked with someone on how to sing or match pitch or what rhythm is or keeping time or developing a sense of pulse. They haven't done that. So now when the ISME team was down in Belize, we're having to work, and you'll see some of the videos on our social media, we're having to work just teaching very basic skills. So that way, when we work, have the teachers apply those in the STEAM program, they at least feel comfortable enough and they have a grounding of some sort. But it very much is like starting with a group of young students that don't have that background either, right? That you're just working on pitch matching and that. So the challenge there in the U.S., there's models, right? If I want to do a marching band, there's thousands of models that you could look at.
Sure.
Now,
Yeah.
if you have a country and there's no music models that's in the school system, who do you look toward? You look toward the models around the world that are existing, but then they don't often match your culture.
No,
So
they don't.
it wouldn't make sense to bring them in that environment.
Yeah, try having a marching band in Belize. It's just not going to
Right.
work at a high school.
Right.
Right.
But
Same.
but
Yeah.
interestingly enough, drum lines are huge there.
Right.
So
That's
drum lines
interesting.
are huge, but it doesn't necessarily translate over to having that. So the school that we're working at is called Itzat STEAM Academy, and one of the teachers who does what they call the maker space, which is where the students actually put together their project-based learning, projects. So they put those together, and he also has a background in music and drums and all this stuff, and so he put together this drum line, but it functions as an after-school activity. It doesn't function within the school day, and there's not really a structure within that. So when we work on embedding the arts, we have to think about how does it tie in to projects that the students are already working on, and what are those tools that the teachers can implement that have a very low hurdle to access. So it's not like they're going to sit down and all start teaching clarinet in the middle of
Right.
a STEM thing. But they can use something like BandLab. They can be doing sampling. They can be doing those kind of things that engender that.
That's really cool. It's interesting when you talk about the curriculum, especially in China and in Asian countries, sometimes that have unified arts curriculums where curricula, excuse me, it's not an English word, is it? But in the end, they have a year 1, year 2, year 5, year 10. This is what you should be teaching in a public school music setting, where I know you know as well as I do that there are some commercialized systems within the US. But when I did this, and here I am confessing to everybody, I was a general music middle school I was a middle school general music teacher
Wow.
for a
Wow.
while, and in addition to chorus at that time. And I'll tell you, one of the most invigorating and exciting pieces was actually having the freedom to change, modify, and experiment with my own curricula, and then codifying it in a way that I could eventually plug and play. But it was all constantly getting feedback from my students, from my community, from the cultures that were represented. And I was really lucky, actually. I was teaching in the Cambridge, Massachusetts schools when I did that, where it's a model UN, because half of the students are children of professors at Harvard or MIT. And I had literally a model UN within my choir. I had students from all continents, and from every country speaking about. I think I had 37 kids in the choir, and we spoke 25 different languages, and it was really wonderful to have that. But then to do a general music curriculum, is that something? And you were talking about the alignment between what happens in post-secondary education for teacher training and pre-service, and then connecting that to the real world. The only reason I could do that comfortably was because I had a phenomenal teacher in undergraduate who very much focused on the development of curriculum as a critical skill within pre-service teacher education. And The Art of Teaching, the John Safier book, was our Bible, right? And I had to learn how to create units, how to create plans that spiraled in skill. But that was something that was intentionally taught to me, which allowed me to be confident when thinking about what was appropriate and what was cool to do. So talk to me about in-service training in places that are not and of course the US is not all the same. I was very lucky. I know there are some music education programs that are not as heavy on the art of teaching as they are on the art of teaching music. But there's additional people, like places in Europe and in Asia and in Australia and in Latin America and in African countries where I'm curious, what does in-service training look like? You mentioned to me before that in Canada, the requirements to be a music teacher were very different than it is for someone in Australia or the US.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge, when you start looking at the different way people are trained, right, is it leads to different outputs. And if there's a like in Belize, there's a lack of training, right? So there's no base model to really look at from the idea of inserting music into the curriculum and building this and being able to replicate it. Even though there's music in the communities, there's nonprofits that help, there's community making sort of experiences. But most of what we look at, and we've been talking about this a lot with ISME, is, and we recently just started the International Teacher Professional Development Center, which was designed to help close some of these gaps by bringing in the experts that we have access to from all around the world to offer classes to ISME members to help sort of up-level those skills. Because if you're in Africa, for example, I know it's it's a very large place, and therefore there may be a university that you can get to. There may be a university that offers music programs of some sort. There may be one that you could pay for. There's all these hurdles that come into place for being able to do that. So if there's not like a certification program, then it becomes everything is a little bit different to how the output is, right? Which is the beauty of the American music program, is because our demographics is so flexible. The challenge is it doesn't look like people don't know what it is. Like if you say marching band, people know what a marching band is, or jazz band, or a rock band. They understand those constructs, right? But if you talk about like general music, you're like, okay, well, what does this do? But we know, at the university now in Wisconsin, I teach. Sometimes I teach general ed, which is it's a requirement open to all students, like a music appreciation. I always have them make music because what's the point, right? We have to be making music to experience music. But I also teach music majors. And I can tell you the difference in the level of students that you're getting in and the interactivity and the way they're able to converse, understand topics, and move things forward in their general passion is so much higher than what you're seeing with the general ed population. So we know that there's something there of getting the students this music education, getting them passionate about music, and getting them passionate about teaching it. So what can you do internationally to be able to get over those hurdles when they're experiencing the same sort of effects that they are in the US? Like the students music has changed a lot, since we started off teaching, right? Music has changed a lot, and our interactivity with music has changed a lot. If we don't alter or change with that, the students will become disconnected, right? And what you're having, and even as I worked on, I'm going to do a little side tangent, but when I was head of music education for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for a bit of time, and they struggle with, they want to do everything all at once. So they're like, I want the high-end orchestra, and I want the high-end marching band, and I want to put popular music in, and I want to do this, and they want to build on systems that maybe aren't that effective anymore. But they're looking at the Juilliard model or the Berkeley model, and they're saying that's what we want. And you're like, well, that's a very specific system that has developed over a long period of time. And so being able to all of a sudden take all that culture and input it into that space becomes difficult. So going back to Belize, what we didn't want to do is come in and say, we're going to tell you, oh, okay, you're going to need to do this ensemble, this group, or whatever, this Western classical, whatever we just started to insert. We're looking at what's in the culture, what maybe has been lost, what can we revive, how can we get people connected to the local music, and then how can we put this modern spin on it so students actually engage with music from there.
That's so fascinating. It's also this, and I know this might not be the topic for today, but
Happy to
there's
go anywhere.
this is a
Happy
really
to
interesting concept of both the glorification of Western classical music from the perspective of something like the Saudi royal family, as opposed to very much an ethnomusicological approach that many music teachers want to take nowadays, where we are really incorporating the voices of the community in order to glorify the community in our educational strategies and in our curriculum. So it's truly fascinating to me to think where, from an International Society of Music Education point of view, are you having conversations with your educators about the role of indigenous music, regardless of where that indigenous population may be coming from? What does Western classical music as a role play in the future of music education, in the future of music training, in the future of the music economy internationally? I mean, of course, popular music is an export, but at a certain point,
Right.
what is that culture? What is that cultural export going to be for some place like Cameroon, or someplace like Thailand, or someplace like Japan? What does it look like in terms of a music educational standpoint?
I think that's fascinating. I had my first class with the group of music majors last night, and we were talking about sort of some of my different experiences in different parts of the world, especially when it comes to the export of popular music. So my first trip to Belize, if I can just take you down a little bit, which was in May, and I was trying. There was like karaoke nights going on, like, and it was all American popular music that was happening, and then it was a lot of like covers, like local covers of songs that were being played on the radio or whatever streaming sort of in the background, and not the. It would be just off enough from the original. And I was like, what's happening here? But the importation, right, of American popular music is a real thing that actually acts as a way to supplant the local musics that were going on, the attractive nature of that. And you see that in other countries as well. Like the ISME World Conference in 2024 was in Finland. And when I was speaking with our hosts, they were saying many of the students don't want to speak Finnish because it's not viewed as being cool as English, because everything they're seeing from the streaming services, from the music, from social media is all in English, and they want to do that. And what you end up happening is the Finnish language then starts going away, right? And what's interesting in Belize, because of the nature of it being a British protectorate until 1981, is that their cultural identity from that side has kind of been lost. So we're sort of reaching back and now making it like and like reaching, it sounds all like, we're going to save the world kind of thing, but far from that. But just trying to do some sort of revival, right? So we get that connection, we get that identity and that spirit. What we're looking for within the school is, what does school culture look like? And how do you develop community? And how do you develop those things that students are proud of and identify with and seek acceptance to or belonging to? And music is one of those things that does that, right? And
Does
and
it better than most things, actually.
yeah, and so one of the things, the projects that we have planned out for this year is just doing something as simple as a school song, like having them write a school song and having them perform a school song, just to get. While that seems almost like, of course you should have a school song. Like everyone in the U.S. has, whether students know it or not, there's something that exists there, right?
The
But
issue
something
is
like,
that most of the students don't know what that song
don't
is.
know what it is, right? They don't know. They don't know what that what it even refers to, right? But that idea. So there's a lot of like push with that. So how do you take something and almost make it like a K-pop sort of infusion? How do you take something that students are going to see cool, like infusing hip hop, but doing it with enough of a Belizean twist that still acts as their own identity into that space, rather than saying these fits and starts of like Saudis were coming in and saying, we want an orchestra and we want to do this and we want to do that, and it's all fine, but there's a long path to have. If you want one of the finest orchestras in the world, right, you either have a long period of training and history, or you buy people, right? You
Yeah.
buy people's
You fly
expertise,
it
and
in.
yes, and
You literally phone in the funk.
right, right, and some of it just the sort of misunderstandings that happened because of that, or what they're trying to replicate. So that's when we're looking at like best practices, or we're looking around the world. I think one of the great things about ISME in general, and especially the World Conference, is you start intersecting, and you're not only learning like the strategies or techniques that teachers are using, but how they look and how they view music and how it intersects with the culture, and those things become very, very important to developing that overall understanding of yourself, understanding of your program, understanding of how you fit in the world around. The difference for us in the US is that our demographics are from e pluribus unum, right? So from many one, right? But that demographics has also changed. So when much of the curriculum was written for music, or people started thinking about band programs or even jazz programs, orchestra programs, it was predominantly white students, right? And that music reflected the music of the culture that was out in that time, or music that they wanted to insert into the culture. As we moved through the 60s and the 70s, especially, most of the city population turned to African American. When you start looking at Philadelphia, New York, and all that, even Milwaukee, where I'm there, right? But within the last 15 to 20 years, most of that population has now turned to be dominated by the Hispanic and Latinx sort of population into it. And meanwhile, we're still back from music programs back in the 50s trying to do those same programs, even though this population has changed greatly. And so it's a little different when I think you look at all culture, because it's really cultures that come up, right? That make it strong, and that fusion, that make it interesting. And when you think, and then I'll move off of this topic, but when you think about
No, it's
the
good.
debates that happen with music, and like, where did country music come from? And people will argue this side and that side and ever, but the truth is, it's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. There were
Yeah.
many cultures that fused into one to make this amalgamation of music. And without either of them, you don't have that same effect, which is why the US has so many different musical styles,
Mm-hmm.
right? And musical, influences that come in.
Yep.
It's just because of all those cultures that come into it. But
It's
people can debate on
yeah.
where something came from all they want, right?
Well, I mean, but that's the thing, is that culture in and of itself is an unusual concept. There is a culture of a group of people, and it's in theory possible to have a culture of two. So, how many relationships do we have in the world? Every one of us comes from all of our different experiences, and so I think, hitting a really interesting point that I hope the music teachers internationally are thinking about, which is that the students' voices, while are extremely important, there needs to be an intentional design for incorporating that culture into the elevated education of a culture, and how that culture begins to grow, right? The idea that everyone in the 1980s and the 90s in the US could sing every jingle from every commercial ever. And that's just the way that it was. That was American culture.
Right.
And then we move forward, and this musical export continues to grow, and classical music doesn't necessarily disappear, but moves into these different corners where it can still exist, and then pops up in certain popular culture references, where all of a sudden sampling is still a big thing, and now digital music has allowed us to reuse a lot of music in the writing of new stuff. I mean, think about Blackpink using the Paganini tune. All of these things that just make everybody go, "Oh my God, that's genius!" And there's that human creativity, and I think that's the interesting piece. Like, is the role of a music teacher to create students who understand the same musical culture and language, or is the goal of a music teacher to create individuals who can use their culture in order to advance their own artistry, their own creativity? Like, where does it fit? Does it, and I think that's a wonderful conversation to have. Do we want to create musicians in a culture that all know the same cultural references and cultural experiences musically? Or do we want to create enough familiarity with the medium that they can then use their own cultures in order to influence, impact, and create the new culture?
Yeah, it's a little bit like the chicken and the egg of what's happening. But what it comes down to, and I think of this from a 30,000-foot level, is when I started studying trumpet, everything was geared toward being a classical trumpet player, right? We became this one lane
Here's a
sort of
quarter note.
highway.
Here's how you play it.
Yeah, it was one lane highway. And when you look at the musical styles and how things are infused now,
Yeah.
you don't have those musical lanes anymore that you did before. You have, I started calling it in my music appreciation class, genre fluidity. And so you have an artist that now, we saw this as collaborations. We have like this artist brings in this other artist, and they're trying to reach more people. But now we're seeing all these what we would have called crossovers, and saying, oh, you're crossing over into the country world, you're crossing over into this world. That is almost becoming non-existent with new artists. Is that they're floating throughout the genres, so they're using that creativity piece, right, to exist in many different genres at once. So when you're thinking about creativity and how it is, you work with the mediums and the instruments and those tools that you have. And because now we have universal access to almost every tool because of the internet, and even further with AI, is that now you can get into any different genre, any different style almost instantly within that space. So, what ends up happening at the end, I don't really know. If you took all the artwork of the world and smushed it into a ball, what would it look like? But what it happens is, if you think Metallica, you think heavy metal. You don't think Britney Spears, you think pop. But now if you go into like Machine Gun Kelly, what is he? What is the category, right? I would hate to, if you go back to the olden days when they had record stores and they used to have them labeled by like R&B and like different rock and roll, different categories. I'd hate to, like, if a record store existed now, I'd hate to be the person there with the record going, what do I do with this album? Because it's almost about the identity of the person, right? The individual's nature of the person versus like what they're in or what genre that they're in to that.
It is really cool to see that amalgamation of skills and amalgamation of cultures that ends up being popular. And we never know what's going to be popular. And we never know what's really going to hit. I mean, now everyone's talking about K-pop Demon Hunter. And K-pop music has been around for decades, but now it's reaching a cultural amalgamation that makes everybody really kind of link and line up and enjoy the heck out of it. I think that's particularly cool about what music and education can do. And maybe it's an interesting conversation to move into. But how do we take music as a profession and not just as a music education profession? Like, how do we move people from being musical as children, which as adults we constantly think about? And this is where I hope CommonTime can have an impact as well, is how do we constantly talk about kids making music. We constantly talk about how do children have formative experiences through music. And then we also have those conversations about adults. There are adult lessons and adult groups and adult orchestras and adult ensembles. And as you mentioned in Belize, when they become adults, sometimes they haven't learned anything. And so in that culture, they may be learning for the first time how to sing in a choir. They may be learning for the first time how to be in a drum line. Even as adults, there's so much discussion about adult music education and childhood music education. I would really like to ask you if you know anything or have any thoughts from your conversations at ISME about how do we transition a child from a musical education to a musical life in post-secondary or as a young adult? Because very often at the age of 18, 19, 20, when children are first emancipated from the home in most cultures, it's even younger than that. The question is, what allows the musician to stay musical, not just culturally, economically? How do we create a cultural economy that endorses a narrative where we can tell kids that being a musician is not just good for your health, but good for your overall life and everything else that goes with it?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and I don't know if I can necessarily represent ISME's perspective, but I can definitely talk about the trends that are happening. If you were teaching in the 2000s, the music makes you smarter was the whole thing, right? Music makes you smarter, raises math scores and these other scores, but it was still, the pathway in is still like that one-way train. It was like, hey, I'm going to start trumpet lessons in fourth or fifth grade, and then I'm going to continue on, and but only you weren't really taught in this idea of, from my own experiences, and I'm sure some people would disagree, but transferable skills. What are those skills that go into every area of music? What I was taught to be was to be a very good trumpet player, to be able to read the parts that were put in front of me, and then to act as part of an ensemble or as a solo artist for this one particular genre of music. And so when I think about actual transferable skills over to the music side of things, whether it's rhythms or chords or learning about, how pop music is framed and verses versus choruses and how bridges are put together, like what are those transferable skills we think about a lot that can allow a student, right, to take music and understand it and then also become a sustaining musician out of it in some way, right? So when I started my music appreciation course, solely from my perspective, I thought about what can I give these students that are going to last them their lifetime? What's the most important perspective that I can pass on to them? We know they're consuming music, and they admit to that. I did a survey. They were spending 2 to 3 hours a day listening to music in some way, shape, or form. That's over 10% of your day that you're spending dedicated to something, and you don't know why necessarily you're doing that. You just know that you're getting some sort of benefit. So when we started dissecting songs and different things like that, it eventually got to the point of where I wanted to take people who had very limited, or there were some people that had music experience, but most of them had no direct musical making experience. Can I get them to perform their own original song by the end of this 12-week class? And I thought it was crazy for me doing it. I was like, why would I ever subject myself to this? And we stepped through it. We built up the skills. We looked at how you construct verses, how you do rhyming schemes, how you do this kind of stuff. And through BandLab and some other programs and from assistants, they all submitted projects by the end, whether it's individual or as a band. And now they came, like there were several students that came to me by the end and said, I want to take more courses like this, or can I be a music minor, or can I perform in some of the ensembles here? They started realizing that they had this skill or this benefit that they wanted more of, but they had separated themselves from that. And then the other side I would go into is this idea of music for health and wellness, which during the 90s, the 2000s, music therapy was a huge trend that people started talking about. Now it's pivoting, and you see artists like Ed Sheeran and many others, going through Lady Gaga, Jewel, going into this mental health space. And how could music be used for mental health? Because we know we use music to help lift us up when we're sad. Maybe you're looking for that commiserating sort of song to identify with. There's those connections there, right? But how can it help us in a very strategic way? And I ended up designing this sort of modular curriculum for public schools. And one of the things I use is that music is a time capsule and also a time machine. We can hear a song that takes us back into that place and exactly, but it also can propel us forward. It can give us the momentum, it can give us the energy, it can give us the strength to do something else with our lives outside of that. And I don't think there's any other medium out there that can have that same sort of impact that music does.
That's fantastic. There are so many sound bites in what you just said. I'm just thrilled to hear your perspective on the overarching reach and envelopment of music in someone's both past and future. And there are very few things in the world that do that. I think that's part of my religion, right? Is this belief that it doesn't matter where you're from, we all have the same emotional reaction when we hear something like the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. We all have the same emotional reaction when we hear, Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet. And it's just these things in classical music that also exist in other places, right? There are vibes, as they say, good vibes that you can get by listening to popular music, by listening to music from other cultures, and you can understand the emotional communication of those things regardless of whether or not you speak the language. So make the song in Finnish, is what I'm saying.
Right.
There's
Exactly.
no reason not to, because if the music's actually good, then it doesn't matter what language you're going to speak, people will love it. And I think that's part of the message, which is very interesting. I think it's a powerful tool for giving kids confidence, as you mentioned, in terms of mental health and well-being. There's this crisis of mental health concern in higher education, in post-secondary, especially in the US. I'm not sure if that exists in the rest of the world, but I would love to talk to ISME about the idea of music as mental health, as community building, as strengthening of culture. within a university. You mentioned to Belize you want them to write a school song. Ultimately, what that does is create this tribalistic sense of community, right? Which results in a sense of belonging, which impacts your well-being and your mental health. And so I think that's hugely impactful. I think that it would be great to talk about music as a mental health supplement from a medical perspective a little bit more. I don't know if you know about, we have another guest on a previous podcast with CommonTime. Michael Bobbitt is the executive director of the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and he actually managed to push through an arts prescribing, social prescribing situation where now healthcare providers will actually subsidize the cost of cultural experiences as part of mental health preventative treatment. The same way that a healthcare provider will give you money back for a gym membership, they might give you money back for a cultural subscription one day is very exciting. The idea that mental health is a holistically viewed part of your PCP visit. Hey, are you exercising regularly? Are you eating? Are you consuming culture?
Right, right, right.
Like, what's your nutrition? And then what's your cultural intake? It's very interesting to me to see how that feels. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to, if I can I
Yeah.
talk to you about something that I think ISME is starting to get going on. I know that there are high level conversations about the possibility of having some form of financial aid or scholarship offering through your organization. And I know that that came from a few different perspectives. I think that you mentioned to me a student in Uganda. Can you tell us a story about her?
About him,
Him,
actually.
great.
Yeah, it's a him situation. So we get many, ISME gets many different kinds of outreach from around the world, especially from different countries in Africa, about providing some sort of assistance. Most of the time, it's around like programmatic help or help for a school, and it's very difficult as a smaller organization that has members from around the world to sort of localize resources. And being a U.S. based nonprofit now, it's very tough for us to get money in to then give out, right? It becomes, why aren't you supporting programs in the U.S.? Those sorts of those inward focus ideals. So we had a student that reached out to me personally from a university in Uganda, and if we could help with the funding of his education. And not knowing translation rates on currencies and things like that, it's like a million something, Ugandan X or whatever the reference is. And I had no idea. I was like, I don't know what this is. And so I was doing the calculations, and it turned out to be less than $1,000. And we happened
For
to,
how much time?
for the entire year,
Oh
for the
wow,
entire year. So
$1,000 tuition
yeah,
for a year
yeah, it was
of college.
it was, and the student had written a letter, and they had a reference in from one of their professors, and they had sent me the bill from the registrar that sort of outlined all the costs and whatnot. Well, we happened to work very closely with one of the professors from that university that also has helped us with one of the regionals and runs what's called PASME, which is the African Regional Conference that happens on the off year of the World Conference. So I reached out to him, and I said, what's the background story here? Because we don't know. We get a lot of different outreach emails. It's tough to sort of sift through, but this seems sort of legitimate. Now, I received this email very early in August. I was leaving I was either in Belize or I was leaving for Belize, and I was there for about 17 days. So, and then when I got back from Belize, I realized that this student was supposed to be starting school within 7 days or 8 days, and they didn't have the funds to do it. In the meantime, I had gotten replies from our contact in Uganda. I said, yes, this is a situation, this is a legitimate cause, and he won't be able to go to school unless there's some sort of outside funding. He was promised a scholarship or had received the scholarship, and then for whatever reason that had stopped or gotten taken away. So there was an immediate hole or deficit and a
I
need
think
for this.
everybody who searched for NEA funding in the last couple of years is familiar with that feeling.
Yeah, yeah, and to have that, and I immediately empathized with that student to think about, okay, I want to be involved in music. I got accepted. Here I am, traveling to this, and now I don't have the funds. So my response was very sort of reaction. Okay, let's at least start raising some money to get the student there. So I started the fund off myself with $1,000, knowing that it was going to fund the student for the entire year, right?
Wow.
And then we started just put it out on social media. It gained a little bit of traction, but then we took a step back and we said, maybe there's something here, right? Maybe there's something there that when I think of rates and I think of costs, I think of U.S. costs for education,
Which are
which
astronomical.
it can be astronomical. University of Wisconsin Parkside that I teach at is very, very reasonable, but still it's 7 or 8 times what the student in Uganda is paying, right?
Sure.
Versus like that might be 80 times what they're paying to go to NYU or Berkeley or Boston Conservatory or any of those places, right? So I realized that for a little bit of money, we can make a massive difference. And I don't think a lot, at least from my point of view, a lot of people realize how far that money can go in other countries and what a difference we can make across that. So our idea, at least in these very early stages, is can we start a global fund for music scholarships for students from around the world that when they see this financial need and stress and they finally get access to a program, can we help them with that hurdle? If there's a shortage of people getting in this field, and if it's a financial barrier, how can we advocate for those students and how can we give them the financing and the funds in order to make that happen? Because if not, what happens to us as not only as an organization, as an entire industry, right? If we don't have enough music teachers coming in or we're not building programs, eventually the organization, what's it going to come down to? It's going to come down to students who can afford the education, right? And now, if we take that and we zoom into the U.S., who's going to be able to afford the tuition to go to an NYU, to go to a Berkeley, to go to the? It's not going to be your impoverished students, even though I know they have great scholarship programs. They're going to look at those costs and realize that's just an insurmountable amount to be able to do. So now, what sort of equity do we have, and what type of students that are we going to have in the programs? And if we back up even further, we're going to say most of the students in the U.S. are probably going to come from suburban programs. Suburban programs are probably going to be centered in the marching band, concert band, orchestra, choirs of the world, right? So now you're taking a student with a very selective experience and you're putting them into the music education programs, expecting that same selective experience. Then they're going to go into an urban environment, into environment, another demographic, and not understand or have the skills to be able to do that. You know, we want to get representation where it's equitable. People that are growing up in differentiated learning experiences in music programs and then bringing that to it. Otherwise, the system is just self-perpetuating, right? It's like it's always like the marching, and I love that. I mean, I taught marching band. I've been in marching bands, you know, for most of my life, but you look at it and say, like, that's what you know, that's what you're going to build. But is that what the community, like our discussion earlier, is that what they need? Is that how we're going to connect with the students? And in some cases, the answer is yes. And in other cases, the answer is going to be no, because we know that there's something about culture and building community, right? The marching band can do that. It builds a culture, it builds a community, it builds a sense of pride. And that sort of that building of that identity is so important to us as humans, and we've lost that. We lost a lot of that. You know, in the U.S. post World War II, think about all the social clubs that were out and all the things that people belonged to, because they were looking for this sense of belonging, the sense to give back to society. We've lost, even though some of them still exist, we lost much of that into this sort of individualized system. So we long for now to have that sense of community. That's why do you think things like the NFL are so popular? You know, or college football is so popular. People root for those programs that never even went to school there. But for some reason they see themselves or see an identity lock with that. And so they get behind that as a fan base. Music should be the same way. When you look at like what we're trying to do, but we need to break down these barriers. And that's when I saw what you were doing, Eytan, with CommonTime, I was like, yes. I've seen other fits and starts of different kinds of connecting students with this or that, the other thing. But the struggle is real, and knowing that we have to get the first gateway is getting students to your program, right? Is getting students to even know about your program, and then realizing there's scholarships there. And universities many times don't even have the capacity to advertise that, or they're not even reaching out to students because they don't have the capacity to advertise to students, or that they, you know, if you're not the major flagship universities or brands that have, you know, a storied like Berkeley or Juilliard, or there's every other program that you can think of that has this massive reach and brand recognition, you get lost. But
Yeah.
that's what, if we want to create equity, we want to create diversity, we have to reach these other programs. And that's where, with CommonTime Pathways, I just thought it was a brilliant idea to be able to provide the motivation for students. And realizing that through my own experience as a band director, I had students who got scholarships to go to school that weren't even music majors. They
Yeah.
got scholarships to play tuba in the wind ensemble or concert band or what have you. They got scholarships to be in the orchestra. They got and they didn't weren't majoring in music.
No,
They
they
got a
weren't.
scholarship because they needed that seat to be filled. They needed that voice, right?
Yep. And I think you're absolutely right on it. It's incredible how common the misconception is that you have to major in music in order to get a scholarship. And it always makes me chuckle because while we're talking about the possibility of extracurriculars, we can simply say that the football player doesn't get a degree in football. And it makes complete sense. The idea that you have this option of being a music major, and in fact conservatory education isn't going anywhere. There's still enough of an ecosystem that it's going to survive, but all of these other programs underneath Juilliard and underneath Berkeley that are going to always be interested in keeping their brand alive, interested in keeping their brand going. And this is about having a brand that survives a culture, or that ends up being kind of an emblem of the culture. And as you, it's just so interesting to me because you talk about the lack of viability of bringing a marching band down to Belize. You could very well do that. You have the proper funding, you have the proper passion, you have the proper teacher, you can do it. The problem is that that culture doesn't absorb it. It exists within a pocket of greatness, and then the moment that teacher is gone, the program evaporates.
Right, right, exactly.
And that's the really interesting thing. So talking about the Super Bowl's not going anywhere. The NFL is not going anywhere. Now, of course, you know, the Rams moved from St. Louis to LA in my time, you know what I mean? But and then the Tennessee Oilers became the Tennessee Titans when I was a kid, and everybody knows all of these things move and change and adapt, but franchises as a whole become emblems of culture. And everyone talks about Taylor Swift as the Super Bowl, the Eras Tour was 100% the idea of when you went to that city during a Taylor Swift concert, there were no hotels, every restaurant was booked, you were basically living on the street if you didn't plan 6 months in advance. It was a traveling Super Bowl. What happens when we don't have a Taylor Swift going around and doing these things? What is the music version of an NFL Super Bowl? And that kind of enculturation of we can absorb it at home on a regular basis instead of just having the TV on and watching your favorite football team in the background, the same way that you listen to music, actually engaging with it in a celebratory fashion. And going to a live game is always going to be better than watching a recording, right? So this is where all of these analogies continue to go. And the thread, forgive me, that I lost a little bit as I was talking about all these wonderful things was this idea that we do need to create an opportunity for connection. We need to create an opportunity and a pathway that allows young musicians to find their way to college, because hopefully one day that kid will be a music making adult and contributor to society, and at the same time, maybe not as a musical professional, but as a high functioning adult who feels culture and feels culture specifically through their music and their music making, as well as their consumption of live music, even in their community, not just the Boston Symphony or the San Francisco Symphony or the LA Phil, talking about the community choir, the local college orchestra, which includes alumni. And that's another big piece of marching band culture, is that a lot of these alumni in these marching bands play in alumni bands. That's not something that happens on a football team. You don't have an alumni football team for the San Francisco 49ers,
Right, right.
much less for the University of, call it Stanford's football team. Stanford's football team doesn't have an alumni division, right?
Right.
And that's the interesting thing, is that the culture remains, and as you mentioned, there's that longevity, there's that moving into the future and tying back to the past at the same time. This is it's really I don't know how I'm tying this all together, but it seems to be
Yeah.
working. Yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, I think the idea too is, being a high school band director for so long, and just being around high school students, and we had tons of students that participated in sports, and so many of them participate in sports. And I say, why are you still doing this? Because they'd be like, I don't really like it anymore, or whatever it would be. And I was like, well, I might get a scholarship in college. And so they were sold on this idea of getting this scholarship in college, because when they look at the college mechanism for recruiting athletes is so widespread, right? It's when every dynamic, and when you look at a team, it's made up of people from all around the country to get the best of the best, and that's
Now
where I
it
love
is.
with yeah, yeah, and that yeah, compared to what it was like 40 years ago, right, where
Exactly.
it's so much localized, and that's what I loved about the CommonTime is that we can take these people that I have many students that are first gen students, first generational students, whether it's to college or to the country, and they're paying for college on their own.
Yep.
Their parents didn't go to college. They're literally just working 2, 3 jobs to
Hmm.
just pay that tuition bill, right?
And trying to
And
finish their essays.
yeah, and so when they're thinking about all these hurdles that are coming into their lives, how many people are just saying no, I can't do that, and doing the jobs instead, or doing another career, right? Let's open up that doorway. Let's open up that pathway, make it as equitable as possible. And that's where I love the idea of common time pathways, as well as these music scholarships of like, what can we do to sort of open the door, and how can we advocate for music, but in a real way that impacts the students? Because you think about that student who now got a, whatever you want to call it, the ISME scholarship for music, and they go through, and now they graduate. How
Now
are they
what?
going to identify with like ISME or giving back to their community or all those other things that come into it? It changes the culture. It changes what they're doing on a very fundamental level.
Sure, absolutely. I love that you're talking about it as an equity piece, but I also love that we're talking about it in terms of just plain access. This idea of a first gen kid thinking that sports is a way to pay for college and music is not given that same credibility, despite the fact that there are more music and performing arts scholarships than there are athletic scholarships awarded every year. And that's because athletic scholarships typically require NCAA approval and regulation, and it's limited to a certain cap. Whereas music scholarships and performing arts scholarships can come from a variety of sources, including unmarked university funds, including preferential admissions funds, including third party, I'm talking nonprofit NGO type money, foundational giving, all of these things that athletes can't access. But beyond that, I think that you're hitting a really interesting point here, which is that the economic viability of college needs to be addressed through music, through the nationalization of a pipeline.
Hmm.
And this is what's interesting, and I love that you brought this up. If you go to Notre Dame now and you want to play on the football team, you can go to high school in California, Florida, New York, Louisiana, who cares? And they can recruit you from there because they have all these different programs that you can have a high school kid put up
Right.
their highlight reel, and now the college coaches know to come and find them. The music programs still operate like it's 1990. If you wanted to go to Notre Dame to play football in 1990, you knew you had to go to one of 12 high schools within a 50-mile radius of Notre Dame so that a scout would find you. That's how we still operate in the music world.
Right.
If you are the recruiter for such and such a university, you have the 200 or 300 music teachers within 150 miles of your institution that are on your call sheet that you say, hey, would you blast out? We're having an info session. And then you get to meet those kids. Those kids give you their information, and now you have to hold it like it's a holy grail. You're not allowed to share that information with other potential recruiters, even if 98% of whatever that list is that you've cultivated doesn't come to you. And that's really where Common Time is, I think, very
Right.
exciting.
Right.
I can share that information because I'm not I am not representative of one institution. And so what's beautiful is I can say, I can get a student from the Syracuse area. And let's say that student wants to end up going to Boston Conservatory instead. That's okay, because every kid that thinks they want to go to Boston Conservatory from the Syracuse area will also now be on Syracuse's recruiting list versus on Boston Conservatory's recruiting list. I'm taking every recruiter in the country and trying to make them play for the same team.
Hmm.
Because instead of talking to the same 200 or 300 music teachers to fill your program, you should be talking to 2,000 or 3,000 music teachers to fill your program. But you can't do that by yourself as a college recruiter.
Right.
You need to work in a large team. And I think that's really where it is nationalizing this pipeline of talent. There's no reason we can't share that data if we don't hold it as an institution. If you give it to CommonTime Pathways, all of a sudden it's just like the Common App. It's just like Max Preps. It's like all of these institutions and organizations that have the intentional design of sharing this recruiting pipeline, of sharing this pipeline of talent. There are 5 million music kids in the United States. I don't think even Eastman has talked to 50,000 of them. So it's just this that's why I love what you're getting at, the idea of this kind of distribution of recruiting pipelines, but also consolidation. Well, not distribution of pipelines, the distribution of just getting a bigger reach, casting a wider net, and being able to create more access points because the kid doesn't have to pay for an expensive summer camp or go to Allstate to go meet a recruiter. It's a
Yeah,
really
and
interesting thing.
I would even flip the equity script the other way from the university's perspective. Because when you look at the recruiting capacity, it's even in football, you see this. Not all the high level schools are created the same, right? And have the same resources. So the schools, I'll go back to the Juilliard again, right? Has a much larger pool of resources than a smaller university with a smaller program, endowments and scholarships. And so their reach and their brand recognition is much greater. If you take a small university, how are they going to identify students? It's a struggle for them to identify students, even in their localized region, to figure out what students want to major in music, because they don't have the capacity to always go out to the schools, to talk to the students, to get them onto campus, to do all these kind of things. And that's regionalized. That could be the one town or two towns over. That's not saying people are in the next state or the other part of the country, right? That may have an interest. And now kids travel all over the country to go to school. They're not really localized to where it was used to be like, okay, what's close by and what can I have access to? And, they're looking all over to do that, to get that sort of educational experience. And there's no way the universities are going to have, especially the smaller ones, have the recruiters. They don't have recruiters in place. It's like the students that happen to find them. And right now, imagine if you're trying to sell a product, but you have no marketing team and you have no distribution team. You know,
As a
and so that
startup founder, I
yeah,
feel the pain.
yeah, exactly, right.
I have a wonderful marketing strategist. She's absolutely fantastic, but I can't imagine where I'd be without her.
Yeah, yeah, and you're also just working and living with academics. They don't have always the skill set, let alone the time with budget cuts, to be able to go out and recruit these students and get them in and the doorway. That's why I really like this idea of something like CommonTime Pathways. And this is not a paid endorsement, just for anyone that's listening, right?
Thank you, though.
It's creating this equity that there is not. Otherwise, think about look at all the colleges and universities that are closing in the U.S. Look at the music programs that are shutting down. And we have to say, why are they shutting down? And some people point to, well, it's a type of programming, which I agree, right? An oversaturation, declining population mark in the U.S. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think it goes down to this equity access of the schools and universities that can invest more funds in their infrastructure, whether it be buildings or recruiting or scholarships, are going to constantly get bigger, and the smaller ones are going to constantly get smaller. And when you get smaller, the overhead becomes higher. Therefore, the main way, and as states cut funding, right, the main way they're going to get it is from tuition. Now, who's going to be able to compete? When you think about it, it's almost like I would use, maybe this doesn't connect with our entire audience, but the Walmart scenario. The idea of Walmart coming in and eliminating the sort of mom and pop businesses, because they can sell things at a cheaper price. They have more things available, and then they have that. And that's what you'll see in the U.S. until we get this equitable distribution. The problem with that is the people who go to these major programs are not going back and investing into their communities.
No.
Right? They're going somewhere else. And if you want to build up this infrastructure into the local communities, you have to build up those local resources in the college and universities, because the students want to give back. They want to give back to the communities. They want those experiences. And if they pull into these major schools, if you live in New York City, are you going to come back to Wyoming at some point? Maybe, but probably not, right? And in some cases they would call it the brain drain, right? If this was quote unquote an academic pursuit of science, technology, engineering, and math, they would say all this talent is leaving our state, right? But we don't look at that through the equitable lens of we have the same thing that's happening in music education, the exact same thing.
Wow. That's a really important perspective. Wow. I need to process that one for a second. That was good. That was big.
It was big.
Yeah, and I know that this is like where we live, and we're so deep in our own hole too that we often find it difficult to resonate with people who don't see how urgent that is. And it is, you're right, it's that person who is both the chair of the department and the marketer and the recruiter and the admissions coordinator and the auditions coordinator.
Yep. Yeah,
All
it's
one.
real. That's
It's
real.
a, I have a friend at Kansas Wesleyan University. His name is Jake Montoya. This dude is doing everything by
Yep.
himself with a purchase card and his car.
Yeah.
And he'll spend the summer traveling from summer camp to summer camp to summer camp around Salina, Kansas, trying to figure out where these kids are going to come from and building his recruiting pipeline. Until, I hope they don't mind I'm putting him on blast, but his administration got a new finance person who, in the middle of a trip where he was a few hundred miles away from home, decided to stop all purchases on his purchase card. Try doing your job when you can't buy gas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
You
it's
can't
like,
even have
okay,
that
I guess I'm
basic
paying.
commodity.
Come
Yeah.
on, guys. I'm already
Yeah.
one person doing all 5 of these jobs for you. Can you please not shut
Yeah.
off my credit card when I'm 250 miles from home? And it's just one of those incredible stories where we want to help these people. We want to help Jake feel like he doesn't have to do everything by himself, or he doesn't have to have a 1, 2, or 3% conversion rate on his recruiting pipeline. We want that
Right.
yield to be 15 or 20%, but we want it to be 15 or 20% of the people that he can communicate with, because he already can filter from this massive pool of talent that he already
Right.
knows. He's got what they want, and he's not wasting his time.
Right.
And so
Right.
I don't know. The little guy is where we want to be, but despite what we're doing for the little guy, it's pretty funny. We're actually, I don't know if anybody who hears this is going to hear this a little too late, but during our upcoming Recruitapalooza conference, this is our first, I suppose, official recorded announcement of this. But Juilliard, the New England Conservatory, and the San Francisco Conservatory are going to be doing a conservatory admissions panel discussion at CommonTime,
Oh, wow.
which will be really exciting. And so, we want to get the word out about that. That's going to be very much blasted out actually this week during the recording that we're doing right now. But, not just the conservatory piece of creating a larger pipeline, because there have to be D1 schools. Ultimately,
Right.
they're due.
Right.
But it's the D2 and the D3 schools that also need this tremendous support of this nationalized
Absolutely.
pipeline.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really why it's so exciting. But thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk with the International Society for Music
Absolutely.
Education. It was so cool to connect with you. It was so cool to connect and hear your stories and hear your dreams and visions for the profession, as well as your perspectives on what's going on internationally. I think, hopefully one day CommonTime will be the place where that student from Uganda can decide to get a master's at the University of Helsinki, at the University of Finland,
Yeah.
or
Yep.
maybe come to NYU, or maybe a student from Chicago wants to go study at conservatory in Tokyo.
Yeah.
Maybe
How
this is the way
amazing.
it happens.
How amazing. Yeah, I feel too, Eitan, we want to do like a regular check-in, just so we can see where you're at, where we're at with the music scholarships and how it's connecting and that growth. But I think what you're doing is just so important. And I work with several universities across the U.S. and the struggles are real. The
Yeah.
struggles are real, and there's so many people. And I think that you had this sort of vision and entrepreneurship to look ahead and say, we can solve this together. We can build this platform. And so
Boy,
I appreciate your efforts, and I'm sure the rest of the ISME members and anyone else who listens to this and that's involved in music does as well. And with that, we're going to sign off, and we'll continue the conversation.
thanks, Ryan. This was a lot of fun.